First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name's Alix Robertson. I'm an associate at the Centre for Education and Youth, and it's great to be here with a fantastic panel to talk about this year's GCSEs. Preparing for our seminar today has been an interesting challenge. After the fiasco surrounding last week's A-level results and Ofqual's algo shambles, the decision was made that GCSE students would receive the highest of their centre assessment grade, or the grade that Ofqual's moderation process would have awarded them in each of their subjects. This U-turn has been met with relief by many teachers and students, and yesterday it was fantastic to see so many young people celebrating their results. The data shows that overall, GCSE results have improved sharply, with almost 79% of entries from 16-year-olds in England receiving a grade 4 or above, compared to almost 70% last year. At grade 7 or above, there was a jump from nearly 22% to just under 28%. The percentage of young people achieving a strong pass, which is a grade 5 or above, has also risen considerably. These improvements in results aren't equally distributed across all subjects. Results in subjects with smaller numbers of pupil entries, such as engineering and performing arts, have increased more than results in larger entry subjects, such as English literature and maths. Despite this difference, the proportion of 7 or above grades in maths and in English rose significantly this year, while double science saw a small increase. And I'd like to give a quick thank you to FFT Education Data Lab for their fantastic statistics. While we have a generally brighter picture this week, concerns remain about how 2020's results have been handled. Notably, 500,000 BTEC students who are expecting to get their grades on Thursday were told at the last minute that they wouldn't be ready in time, and young people may have to wait another week to receive them. At our A-levels seminar last week, teachers and school leaders described their loss of trust in the government and in Ofqual. Furthermore, it remains unclear how this year's results will impact on future cohorts. We have an excellent panel joining us today to help make sense of this week's results and also the fallout from what feels like constant and major changes in policy. I'd like to go through some brief housekeeping before we get started. The session will open with the panelists sharing their thoughts on this situation, and we'll be recording this session and live tweeting it from the Centre for Education and Youth Twitter account. Following this, our audience, welcome everybody, thank you for being here. We'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A function, and I'll select questions and put them to the panel. If you'd like to do this, at the bottom of the screen, you can click Q&A, you submit your question, and please add your name and organisation, and then I'll be able to pose it to the panel. If you'd like to address a specific speaker, please make this clear. You can also upvote the questions that you particularly want to see asked. If the Q&A isn't working for you, please message my colleague Will Millard, who will be ready to help you with any challenges. If you'd like to contribute any more general comments or thoughts, please put these in the chat box. Finally, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our panel today. We have with us David Thomas, who is Principal of Jane Austen College, Claire Price, Principal of RSA Academy in Tipton, Emma Weinberg, Deputy Head of Sydenham School, Stephen Tierney, Chair of Head Teachers Roundtable, and Aretha Banton, co-founder of Mindful Equity UK. We're also especially pleased to be joined by two young people, Ray Banton and Hanifah Smith, who are here to share their experiences. A warm welcome to all of you. Let's get started on some questions about how you're all feeling after what has been a really tumultuous couple of weeks. David, Claire and Emma, I'd like to come to you to talk about what's happened in your schools on results day for GCSEs yesterday. So perhaps we could start with Claire.
I think you're absolutely right. It's been the end of the most tumultuous exam series and results series of my professional career, and I've never experienced the like of it, which is perhaps even more perplexing given that we didn't actually sit any exams, and Ofqual and the exam boards had a significant period of time in which to get the situation right. And I think for me what it has shown is the best and the worst of the system. The worst is about using the wrong drivers, valuing the wrong things, confusion, lack of clarity, which I'm sure we'll pick up on later on in the discussion. And the best has certainly been the young people. So for me, the students who've shown enormous resilience, courage, fortitude in what's been the most difficult situation. School finished for them very suddenly in the middle of March. They carried on doing some work for GCSEs that were then stopped. They then went on to prepare for their next destinations, working from home with that. And the playing field was never level for them. And so they've gone and got results, which at the last minute weren't complete results, and they didn't know what they were actually getting. But actually on the day, the kids, their just optimism and sense of purpose shone through. It was an absolutely lovely day, even though some of them are still uncertain about their destinations, given the lack of BTEC grades, and are still a little bit uncertain about what the future holds for them. But actually, if we've got anything that we should be really judging this season by, if we judge it by the young people, we're in a good place for the future.
That's lovely to hear, Claire. Thank you very much. I think you're absolutely right. Emma, perhaps we could move on to you. What's happened in your school this week, and how have your young people been affected?
Yeah, so we like Claire, have actually, I've been flabbergasted by the journey from March the 23rd until, August the 20th. What's gone on in that time period, you honestly couldn't write. It's just been constantly changing, even up until the day before the results came out, that decision to merge the moderated with the CAGs. I feel that teachers have been placed in quite a vulnerable position, actually, because all the way through this, one of the things that we've been concerned about as a school is that students obviously can take it very personally when they've had a grade set by the teacher, and you can get into a sort of period of conflict. And we've tried to avoid that and make sure and reassure our students that we've taken all the steps needed to generate the grades. And ultimately, the teachers who've taught those students know them better than anybody. So we've wanted to actually use it as an opportunity to change the landscape, if you like, about GCSE exams full stop. But I feel that the government's interference with that has made it quite difficult. We decided to hold our results day remotely so that we could get all of our results out quite quickly. We've got quite a large cohort of students. And actually, I'll let Hanifah share with you how she felt about that. But it was really empowering that all of them got their results by 8 o'clock yesterday morning. And then we were able to spend the morning focusing very much on the next steps and supporting them with that so that they don't feel disadvantaged in any way. Interestingly, it went incredibly smoothly. And we were able to, we had the time to be able to take the steps we needed to support them. So it's a nice line of closure to actually say, with the results are in, they're not all in, we are still waiting for those BTEC results, but largely students are now in a position to move forward.
And that's the main thing. I think it's important that we start looking to the future now. Great. Thank you so much, Emma. David, how are things from your perspective?
I mean, I just want to focus on the children that we've had in our school who've been phenomenal. And results day for us was a lovely way to try and celebrate their achievements. And when we met as staff in the morning and talked about our priorities for the day, the biggest one was making sure that politics and confusion and frustration doesn't overshadow the achievements of the young people who've worked incredibly hard for years and just got grades that they absolutely deserve. And no political upheaval, no amount of frustration, no amount of other concerns should be able to overshadow that for them. It's not right that every other cohort should be able to celebrate and feel proud of what they've done, and that they should have that overshadowed. So we just wanted to focus on that. And had a lovely day. We gave them the option of coming in or of getting them remotely. And lots of them chose to come in. If they came in, they had to book a slot so that there weren't too many people, but that meant they all got to pose and take their celebratory photos next to the balloons set out. They all got to come in and get their ice cream on the way. It was a boiling hot day in Norwich, and come and celebrate together. And they're lovely kids, and we've missed them. We haven't seen them in person since March. We've been doing all of our Zoom lessons, and they've been working incredibly hard, whether that was keeping options open for being able to take autumn exams or carrying on studying, doing bridging courses ready for what they wanted to do in the September that's coming up. They've all been doing their timetables and working really, really well. So it was lovely to see them back in person again, and to be able to celebrate with them and to be able to congratulate them. They worked incredibly hard, and this has already been said. I think that one of the things that they should take from this and that we should take from this is the resilience that they have is actually much greater than people give them credit for. And we often talk about, the youth of today, and about them maybe not being resilient, about them having problems that previous generations haven't had. It's always the narrative, and maybe has been throughout all of time when people talk about the youth of their day. But the youth of our day have just got through a crisis the likes of which we haven't seen for decades. And they've just done it incredibly well. At least the 180 that I'm lucky to have just seen through year 11 have done it incredibly well, and should be really proud of that. And so that's the message that I would love them to be taking. And I think we should really be focusing on coming out of results day.
That's perfect, David. Thank you so much. And I think you're absolutely right. It's really important to acknowledge the fact that not doing an exam doesn't mean that you haven't done an awful lot of work to prepare for your future, and worked really hard in your subjects. And so it's lovely that to hear that all three of you have been able to have an opportunity to celebrate with your students. And for our students here today, Ray and Hanifah, thank you so much again for being here. We'd love to hear about what Results Day was like for you yesterday, what happened in your schools, and how are you generally feeling about how exams have happened this year after all the strangeness that we've been through. Perhaps we could start with Ray.
Yeah, nice. So thanks for having me again. And yesterday was very prompt for our school. We decided to go in time slots of 10 minutes for our tutor groups, and it was pretty much in and out. It was very formatted, and everyone, like David and Claire said, and Emma, the resilience that was shown yesterday on social media, everyone was wishing luck, praising. It was really nice to see, and like everyone came in confident on results day, and everyone seemed very happy with their results.
That's really nice to hear. Yeah, I think it's great to hear that people are feeling a bit more positive now, and after last week, that's a really welcome change. So thank you for sharing that, Ray. Hanifah, what was your experience like?
Yeah, so for us, we had our results via email, and we enrolled via email as well. We got sent a link. But I quite liked it. It kind of left each family to kind of celebrate in the way they wanted to. For me, my dad printed out the results and we opened it in the envelope like we wanted. And I think that even though I wasn't able to go into school, I think I definitely felt like my teachers were kind of there, and they were there for me and kind of supporting me, which was really, really nice. And definitely in the lead up to results day, I'd gotten some emails just saying from the school, just giving general advice and support, and saying, careful not to compare yourself, try and stay off social media if you're worried, and just kind of, just really being there for the students, which I really liked. And even though David Thomas was saying how it's difficult to take away from all the political upheaval when we're trying to talk about, results day, and trying not to let that overshadow it, I think it definitely had, there was definitely there. And I think it's quite hard to separate results day from all of that, because in a way, ultimately, it's not really my results, it's just my predicted grades. And I just think going forward, there'll definitely be a lot of young people that are going to be pretty angry. And when it comes to voting in the next few years, I definitely know I'll be using my vote, and I think a lot of young people will be as well.
I'm glad to hear that you feel that there is something potentially empowering to take away from this situation, that going forward that you can make your voice heard. And I think one of the great things about what we've seen is so many young people putting forward their views really clearly and standing up for what is important to them. And so I'm really glad that you feel that that you can do that too, Hanifah. And it's lovely to hear that you were able to open the envelope as well. I remember that moment myself, and it is special.
Yeah, my dad drew a fake little stamp in the corner and wrote my address on it, which is great.
Oh, that's lovely. Your dad sounds wonderful. Good man. I'd like to turn to Stephen and Aretha now, who are going to give us a little bit more of a broader overview of what things have been like in the sector. Aretha, perhaps you could start on how you are sort of getting a sense of how teachers and school leaders are feeling at the moment after everything that they've been through in the last couple of weeks.
Overwhelmed, exhausted, but very hopeful is what's come through for me. This was and is an exceptional year, so therefore it required a really exceptional and well thought out approach, and a cross-party approach, a collaborative approach with the engagement of unions and teachers and professionals and the DfE and everybody that is involved in the whole education system. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen, well, because of time pressures and everything else, but it didn't happen because there was a lack of engagement from certain parties, I feel. Had that happened, we would have been in a very different place, and much of this uncertainty and anxiety would have been avoided. And I think, you know, I acknowledge that no system is flawless, and this new of the newest options seems to be the best option to go forward. But I think the journey to where we are at could have been a less painful one. For me, there's been a huge sigh of relief. I'm very pleased with the results for my son and for the students at our school. We've seen some excellent grades across the countries. We had on-site opening, and that was lovely because we actually got to see lots of smiles, lots of happy tears, which is always lovely. But really, just echoing what David said, lots of optimism and hope and resilience from our young people and from our staff. And I think, you know, this experience definitely is a lot less stressful than last week. It's a different vibe, a different atmosphere, and that's good. But there for some, there is still the anxious wait for BTECs and appeals, and that does need to be acknowledged because that's a lot of students who are usually from disadvantaged backgrounds who are waiting to know what their next steps are, and that's still not acceptable. But as the dust settles, we need to look forward. We need to make sure that we have really secure and robust plans in place for our future cohorts. We don't know what's around the corner. We're preparing to open our schools. It's a very difficult time. And we need to be prepared and better prepared if we end up in this situation again. So hopefully we'll be reflecting back and reviewing what's happened and coming out with some really sustainable plans that support our students in the coming years.
Yes, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that teachers also have the pressure to be ready for September now. You're absolutely right, Aretha, and it's tough enough after a 6-week summer holiday, let alone after what everyone has been through this year. And so to be balancing the stress that has happened as a result of the exams process with all of that preparation as well is a pretty significant challenge. And I think we're all really impressed at everything that schools and school leaders have done to keep things moving forward and in the right direction. Thank you. Finally, Stephen, would you like to give us your perspective from the bird's eye view of the Heads Roundtable?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, first of all, because Tuesday night for a school leader was always a sleepless night because the results you'd see on the Wednesday ready. And yet many of the heads I'm speaking to are saying, I know I had a great sleep on Tuesday night because we kind of knew what was happening. Unfortunately, they then had a sleepless night along with exam officers on Wednesday as they unstuffed envelopes, restuffed envelopes, resealed them, or whatever the digital equivalence is. And I think one of the questions going forward is about communication within the system because it doesn't seem to talk to each other. BTEC deciding 4:30 on Tuesday that they needed to have a rethink is kind of bonkers. They must have known well in advance of that. So it's kind of been a different dynamic. And also on the actual day itself, whereas kind of schools would gather results and then wonder what the school did down the road. Nobody seemed to care what the school did down the road. And so the changes in terms of how the grades were awarded, the performance tables, the accountability system in general, meant there was a very, very sharp and almost sole focus on young people, which kind of feels about right. And I think there's some interesting questions going forward in terms of that around performance tables, accountability system, certainly for next year, because you've got kind of some year 10s who've already got the centre assessed grades, which at the minute won't go in the performance tables. And now in English, that's going to have a massive difference. So there's going to be an outcry about that. And if they do go in the tables, then there's going to be an outcry about that. And then there's part of me that thinks, well, the world hasn't stopped turning using centre assessment grades and no performance tables. So what is it that the system actually requires? And linking into parents as well around information. I think just the confusion around the centre assessed grades and versus the calculated grades. And then people looking backwards and forwards to previous years. And I'd kind of almost say park it. It's like trying to sort out whether oranges are apples or apples are oranges. They're not. They are two very, very different things. And nobody's going to forget 2020. And just final thought for you. There's a part of me which is wondering whether long term we might just have provided more young people with opportunities post 16 and into further education or into employment and apprenticeships that in previous years we've deliberately as a system prevented. So people might be familiar with the term the forgotten third. So a third of pupils using examination system, we automatically make sure they go below what is that key grade 4 in English and maths. Now that's not happened this year, and I'm very interested going forward whether we have suddenly given opportunities and life chances to young people that in the past we've denied them, and whether that might be a good thing. So it's how will it play out? So just some different thoughts.
All really important points, Stephen. Thank you. And I think, yes, we absolutely need to acknowledge the administrative burden that schools have faced in tackling the rapid changes that the government has put them through. I think there are a lot of people maybe behind the scenes a little bit more who really deserve everyone's thanks, and we can all be impressed with the work that they've done to pull things around and make sure that young people are getting the information that they need on the day ready for them. And I think looking to the future is really important now, and it's absolutely the time for us to say we have young people who've been through an awful lot this year, and what can we do best to make sure that they have all the opportunities available to them going forward, and that the pandemic has as little impact as possible on their options for the future and the opportunities available to them. So I think further education colleges, universities, sixth forms will all be thinking really carefully about that, and it's great to see some across the board saying that they are ready to take young people in spite of the changes around what their results have shown to be. I think it would be good to have a little bit of a think about the impact on young people's perspectives going forward as a result of this. I'd love to know what each of you think about how the experiences this year may have changed your young people. We heard Hanifah talk to us about feeling empowered to really put forward her point of view. And we've seen from the A-levels challenges last week that there are a lot of young people who have come out, spoken out, and actually have been a big part of driving the U-turn that we saw happen from the government in terms of putting the algorithm to one side. Are you getting a sense across the board that your young people are feeling up for the fight now and ready to put forward their point of view in a way that maybe they wouldn't have before? Or are we getting a sense of frustration and confusion more? Because it's been really difficult to get the information that you need at the moment. I'd love to know what you think. To start off with, Claire.
I think it's been very difficult for our young people, and the difficulty has come from, I serve a community that's characterised by disadvantage, and for our young people, actually life chances are sometimes quite hard to come by. And added with the media picture of teachers overinflating grades, or listening to one of our colleagues talk about, I didn't actually get these grades, they were my predicted grades. I think we've got a lot of work as a society to do to say, well, actually, these are absolutely your grades, these are absolutely your life chances. And we've got to start unpicking what we think these exams are all about. We've got to start saying that actually we've acknowledged your 11-year educational journey. We haven't taken a snapshot that's high stakes. We've looked at what rewards and records your achievement over time. We've given you the opportunity then to go on as a society and take your rightful place in these different destinations, be they apprenticeships, FE, going on to employment-based training routes, going on to university in the future. And it's a different thing, and I don't think the media has necessarily helped with that when the outcry has been about too many high grades, too many this, too many that. Exams should be about young people, exams should be about their educational opportunities and their educational achievement. And one of the most difficult things for me, I suppose, was reading about how either BAME students or disadvantaged students have been unfairly awarded grades that in the past they wouldn't have been, when actually they've been awarded their achievements for what they've done, which is, as a system, as a group of head teachers, as a society, we should be really proud of.
Yes, thank you, Claire. That's really, really helpful. And you've raised two issues there that I think are really important for us to follow up on, in terms of the challenges around the centre assessment grades. So we have seen some people saying that grades have been too favourable. We've seen some people saying that potentially using teachers' grades doesn't protect against biases for young people from particular protected characteristics. Emma, what do you think about some of these challenges that we've seen to the decisions being made by schools and teachers?
Yeah, well, I think we've got a big job to support our young students now with their next step, because my biggest concern is that a number of them haven't actually been, they were kind of cut short in their learning journey. And for a number of them, the amount of learning that they've been involved with between now and lockdown is quite limited in that formal sense. They've done lots of things and learned lots of new skills, we know, but actually getting them back into that formal setting of learning, I think for some will be a challenge. And I think we've got to do everything we can to support them through that. Thinking about their well-being, they'll all be coming back with a number of different experiences that we're not even aware of yet. So I think supporting them to make sure that they can achieve on the courses that they've chosen, so we can avoid that criticism that Claire's, describing, that these grades are inflated and they're not going to cope. They're not, they've got a great opportunity here to move forward, but they will need that support to make sure that we can get them off the ground and feel confident about their learning as quickly as possible. So a lot of time is going to be needed to be invested in them to do that. And I think we've got the pressure of, the current year 10 transitioning into year 11, the current year 12 going into year 13. So we've got 3 year groups that are really quite vulnerable, that are going to need a lot of time, not to mention the rest of the school. So yeah, a lot of focus on just not expecting them to just immediately transition back into it. They'll need support.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Aretha, would you like to add anything on this point?
No, I just think, we do need to make sure that we have a really secure plan in place for those students, particularly those who are disadvantaged and who have, been trying their best to keep up with their studies at home, but for whatever reason have been disadvantaged by the fact they've had to miss out on in-person teaching. I think whatever plan we put in place going forward needs to incorporate the fact that we may end up in this situation again. And we need to look at our whole system to make sure that if we do end up in this situation again, that disadvantage is not there and doesn't take place in a way that limits the opportunities for our young people. They've been incredibly resilient. They've been incredibly engaged. And, for the young people that I know, they've worked their socks off. And as Claire was saying, this is the end of the year 11 years in education. It's not just about this year. It's about all of the efforts they've put in. It's about all of their knowledge. And for some, like Hanifah was saying, there is a bit of, they didn't get to sit their exams and have, that final assessment that goes, yes, I've got my grades. But actually, teachers do know them best. They've worked with them. They have seen what they're capable of. And they've given them grades that they feel they would have achieved had they sat the exam. And on the whole, I don't think there's been a lot of overinflation. I can't say, because I don't have all the facts and all the dust hasn't settled yet, so we just don't know. But, I think for me, for the people that I know and that I have worked with, and for my son, I think the grades pretty much balanced out. And we just need to have a really clear plan in place going forward to make sure that the next cohort aren't disadvantaged in any way, shape or form.
That's going to be our next challenge, isn't it? We've got an interesting question here from Samantha Booth at Schools Week. Did any of you see any situations yesterday where pupils were given an off-qual moderated grade that was much higher than their centre assessed grade? Because obviously the decision was made that they would get the best of either. What are the details, if so, and do you plan to appeal those situations? David, have you had any of those situations occur?
We've not had any that were considerably higher. We had a small number of movements that were largely by just one grade, and I think they were in very specific subjects where the distribution of achievement that we predicted for this year was quite different to the distribution of achievement from previous years, just because of the people who'd chosen a particular option subject. So it had intended to happen where we had some smaller groups, but nothing on a very large scale, and nothing, to a situation where I would say it is egregious to want to appeal it. Definitely not. I think there were some small movements in some of the smaller subjects, but nothing at a big scale.
Thank you. Claire, have you come across any of those situations?
No, we had no movement from our centre assessed grade to the off-qual calculated grade, which perhaps I'd pose a question back again, given that I've talked about being in a school of high disadvantage, where the exam system doesn't always recognise students' achievement. Perhaps the question back is, why are we focusing on these odd anomalies where people have made massive boosts from the centre assessed grades to the off-qual grades, and why aren't we actually focusing on the inherent unfairness of the system year on year on year, and not just a perceived unfairness for some students for this year?
Thank you. A very valid question. Emma, do you have anything to add on this particular point?
No, I mean, we did have some, but it was literally one grade, and it was in a sort of few subjects, so nothing that stands out as being a concern. So no, that I don't feel the inflation's been that large.
Thank you. And we've got another question here for Ray and Hanifah. In terms of this year's results, have you been affected at all by the lack of the kind of usual experiences that you'd be expecting to have when you come to term end? Things like a prom or an end of term assemblies, the experience of being able to go out and celebrate results with friends. Have you missed out on any of those opportunities, and how are you feeling about it? Is there anything that your schools could do to kind of maybe help you with that celebrating an end of year process? Hanifah?
Yeah, I can go first. For me, I don't really feel like I've missed out that much, and I think part of that is due my school has definitely done lots. On the last day of school before lockdown, we kind of ended up all signing each other's shirts and stuff. I think the issue is that not everyone was in school, but that's not something the school could have helped. But they, yeah, definitely kind of made the most of what they could, and I don't really think it's their responsibility to get everyone back in, because it's quite unsafe. And yeah, we've had like Zoom calls and things like that, and I think a lot of responsibility kind of lies with friends and their kind of groups and circles to organise meetups or Zoom calls or things like that. But the school has definitely helped, and I think at this point I definitely have the kind of closure. Like I definitely feel like year 11 is finished and I've gotten my results and everything now. But yeah, definitely I think that as soon as kind of lockdown started and I stopped going to school, it did feel like a very sudden drop, considering how much momentum was building up to the exams. And I think during that period there was just so much uncertainty. I think that was quite difficult at that time, but now everything's good, and I think results day was a really joyous occasion. It was really nice to celebrate something amidst everything else going on.
I'm glad to hear that. Would you be willing to share with us what you're going on to next year?
To take in terms of like subjects, or just... Oh, I'm going to take art history and French, and I'm going to go to SFH 6, which is my secondary school, and it's tied with the boys' school just down the road, and I'm really excited.
That's lovely to hear. Congratulations, and best of luck with all of those studies. It's a really interesting mix of subjects. Hanifah, How about you, Ray? How have your experiences been? Do you feel like you've missed out on those social opportunities?
I really don't think that we've missed out too much. I feel like in terms of everyone communicating and having that celebration and that end closure of year 11, if everything was running smoothly, well, as smooth as possible considering the current situation. But like overall, I think everyone's been able to have that closure and that kind of relief of opening your results, coming out of school knowing year 11's over.
Yes, it's a huge achievement, and I'm glad that you feel like that you have that sense of closure and can celebrate. And will you be willing to tell us what you're going into next year?
Yeah, I'll be going back to my sixth form, and I'll be taking maths, economics, government and politics, and economics.
Wow, that's a stellar mix. Fantastic. Best of luck to both of you. It sounds like you've got really exciting things ahead, and thank you for sharing. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the young people who are still waiting on their BTEC results. What do you think we need to be doing in the time where they are in limbo to help them get through the next few days and feel supported? Stephen, do you have any thoughts on how schools can look after these students at the moment?
What I would look at is the BTEC is likely to come alongside a whole series of other qualifications, and I would hope that many young people have already got the qualifications they need to be accepted onto courses. So the first thing that we'd be saying largely to institutions is, can you already see that this young person has got more than what is required or has got sufficient to actually be admitted to courses? So it's almost like, I think you can act as an institution whilst the BTECs come in and just secure for that young person a little bit of peace of mind and say, it's fine, give us your BTEC result when it comes in. We are interested in that because that's one of the qualifications, but there's not a lot of courses that are solely dependent upon BTECs. So what I would hope to see is young people, and these two are an example, it's going to be great because they've got the get up and go and they feel empowered to say, look, I've got this and this and this, that's enough, sign me up, I'll bring you my BTEC later. But I just think it just shows the system to be shoddy. It just, you know, you're kind of almost embarrassed at how the whole thing has come out. But for young people, I think they should be knocking on the door of institutions, and institutions equally should be knocking on their door saying, come on, you've got what's needed. Let's make sure that this happens. Because as I say, I think the BTECs are likely to be limited in the number that are being sat by each pupil because of the system that we have.
That's really helpful, thank you. Yes, and we do want to see institutions, further education and sixth forms going out to these young people and showing them that they are still welcome and have what it takes. Does anyone else have any experience of large numbers of students on vocational courses still waiting? Claire, have you had any experience of this at your school?
We do have a fair number of students waiting for BTECs, and for them, I think, to echo what Stephen says, for a lot of them it's a complementary qualification, and for a huge number of them it's a passion. So we've got music, drama, art, sport, all hanging outside. It's their passion, it's their route way that they want to take. My experience is in the locality is that FE colleges have actually done a good job of reaching out for some students for whom grades are not yet available. I think obviously if they're returning to school, we know the children, and we're there putting those ladders back up for them in order to support them. And I think perhaps one of the questions is for us as educationalists is that actually we know that children's learning has been disrupted. We know that their paper qualification isn't necessarily there at the same time as it usually is, but they're still the same young people turning up in September to the same courses, and we should be putting in the same support and the same induction and the same recognition that actually there has been a pause in learning for young people just taking exams before September starts. So I think the system itself should be able to support the young people with or without the grades in their hand as they enroll, and be able to put on the teaching and learning to make sure that they're very successful in the next year or 2 years of their studies.
Absolutely. It sounds like you're feeling quite positive about their experiences going forward. Do you have any concerns that they could miss out on places at the next stage of education while they're waiting?
I think there are examples, and we've been working as a school very hard to make sure that no young person who's in our year 11 is missing out on a place. I think there are apprenticeships that are going to be tricky. They were going to be tricky anyway. I think the government needs to look at funding of places in FE to be able to support young people for whom that is their traditional route rather than a school-based route. I do think that in the next 2 years, some of these young people could be disadvantaged, especially those following more vocational pathways. And it's up to us as professionals to make sure that we don't just advocate for them today, or we don't just advocate for them while we're remembering that we've been in the middle of this crisis, but we use this as a spur to action to advocate for them every day and to actually put the challenges back. What are our qualifications for? So why are we using qualifications for too many drivers in the system? Why are we not just using them to recognise young people's talents and achievements? Why are we using it as a temperature for the system? And why are we using it as a temperature for, worse than that, the whole of the DFE with grade stability and everything like that? So I think it's our job now to advocate for young people by also advocating about the system.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful. I'd like to turn to thinking about young people with special educational needs or disabilities. And I know this is something you have particular expertise in, Aretha. I wonder if you might be able to share with us any thoughts about how these pupils in particular have been affected over the last couple of weeks, and whether they've been able to make plans to move forward in the ways that they had hoped for.
From what I've heard and the kids that I know, they've all had really, really great results, and they've been able to secure their next step. So it's just that BTEC cohort that we're worried about, and that's not particular to this school, it's about the broader picture. But in terms of thinking ahead and going forward, as I alluded to before, if schools do need to go back into lockdown or partial closure, it's about making sure that students with SEND aren't disadvantaged there. We know there's an issue with laptops. We know there was an issue with actually how do you provide that specialist support to students with SEND when they're not physically on. You can't give TA support. You can't give them that advice that would usually get with in-person teaching. How do you deliver speech and language assessments and interventions? Is remote the best way of doing it? Do they actually need more of those specialist interventions? How do you get the EP input and all of that sort of stuff? And that's the stuff that really gives the uplift for those students with SEND. It's not just about that final grade, it's about the process and the consolidation and the actual addressing the SEND needs. That's the bit that needs to be considered when we go forward. And we do need to find a better way of doing that. We've had to do it on the hoof, and there's been lots of different ways of doing it, and some have been better than others. But we do need to think about that as SENCOs and think about actually how we're going to make sure that the students get the remote learning right, but also have access to the specialist support that they need to develop those underlying skills and that understanding in order to progress to the next stages. Because there's no point in them getting a great grade if they don't have that skill set. Because if they haven't addressed speech and language needs, for example, moving into another stage of education is going to be quite tricky because they haven't had the support that they need to address those underlying SEND needs.
Yes, it's consolidating those skills that really makes a difference, isn't it? And the remote learning does make that challenging. I wonder whether you'd be willing, Ray and Hanifah, just to give us a brief overview of your experiences of remote learning coming up to this point of the end of term. How have you found it? Ray, would you like to start?
Yeah, so we had online classes throughout most of the time, setting work every 1 to 2 days, and it was expected to be completed, and for the most part that I saw, everyone was completing the work. And yeah, overall it was kind of hard to keep up with you getting so many notifications from different teachers all the time, and the volume of work kind of varied from subject to subject. So some days you might have tons of workload, and then some days you just might not have any.
Did you feel like you knew how to ask for help if you needed to, or where to get support?
Yeah, they made it pretty clear that you should just message on the class to ask for help, and they would get back to you within a few hours probably.
Great. I'm glad to hear that you feel like your school supported you.
Yeah.
How about you, Hanifah? What's it been like learning from home?
I definitely think my school supported me, but I think once lockdown started, the kind of cut off from a constant like stream of learning and education was probably a bit more sudden, and I didn't have like remote learning, so we had work sent to us, like worksheets and things. We were expected to send them back, but I think for a lot of people it was quite easy to just it kind of felt quite optional, because it's not as confrontational in the way just receiving worksheets and sending them back than being in a classroom or being on a Zoom call with your class. I think a lot of people in my school, and me as well, are quite self-motivated and were getting on with work, and shortly after lockdown finished, not like around a month later, we started getting transition work for sixth form and things like that as well. So I didn't really feel like I was just kind of left to my own devices, but in the same way I kind of was, because yeah, I did kind of feel like in a way it was sort of optional, and I was just doing what I wanted, and I really like learning, so I was doing a lot of it, but I don't know if that was the case for everyone. And yeah, like I did really like doing all this kind of transition work and kind of beginning to focus down to the subjects I liked, but it did feel quite sudden, and it kind of forced me to think about sixth forms before I was really ready to, and I still was kind of in that whole, I had this big revision timetable on my wall, and I just kind of took it down because it was sort of over.
It's a pretty drastic change, isn't it? And motivating yourself to complete the work in the way that you would do in a class situation is a very different experience, but hopefully that will really set you up well for more independent learning in the future. So well done on getting through that, both of you. David, would you like to come in on this point?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that shows up in remote learning, which actually I think has been a theme throughout this, is just the inconsistency in the system, and therefore the inconsistency of the experience that we give to our students. I think there's a natural tendency very often in the press to report a generalization and to report something that maybe exists as a minority and report it as if it's happening everywhere, which leads to a tendency from the education profession to come back with the opposite generalization. And the reality is that there's just an inconsistency across our system. And particularly, you see that at times of crisis. So remote learning, you see some children in some schools who have a full timetable of online lessons with teachers available as soon as you want them, sitting there in a Google Meet or a Zoom call to help you, where if you have low literacy or special educational needs, the TA is in a breakout room off the side of the class ready to give you support. You also have schools where there is, a work pack sent home at the start of lockdown, you don't hear anything else. Now you see that in the data, you see that in the research that's happening in the surveying, in the teacher tap surveys, in NFER surveys to young people. What we are seeing is just not a general picture. It's an inconsistent one. And I imagine that we're looking at something similar when we come back in September. And so the caution that I would give when we think about this is not to overgeneralize either that everyone is positive or everyone is negative, but actually to recognize that there is a deep inconsistency at the moment. And if I were thinking about policy, about advocacy, actually right now in the short term, it would be about getting a consistent high quality experience to all young people, so that when they're coming back into school or college in September, they are well looked after. Like, we need to, as Aretha said, our SEN young people are the ones who are most likely to struggle with remote learning. If you face difficulties with literacy and all of your work comes from reading work packs, like, of course you're going to have a worse educational experience. We just need to be making sure that we're keeping schools open, we are getting young people in, and we're giving them the best possible support to catch up where that's needed, and getting consistent high quality, and find a way of doing that in the system so that there's not a lottery of, if you go to one school, you get the right quality support, and if you go to another, you don't.
Absolutely. And I think now that we have been through this experience and can breathe and reflect on what has happened, it's absolutely the right time for both policymakers and practitioners to be thinking about how to hone that sort of support, because there's every chance that we will have to manage remote learning again in the future. And as you say, it can certainly be improved based on what we've learned. Thank you. We've got a question here from Eleanor Busby at PA. It's been suggested that more students will be admitted onto A-level courses or into sixth forms than in previous years due to the higher grades that we've seen. Do you have any concerns that some of these pupils might struggle next year academically, particularly since they've been dealing with a number of months out of school? And what are schools planning to put on in terms of additional catch-up work for these students to ensure that they don't struggle with the courses going forward? Emma, I wonder if you'd like to come in on this one.
I think that's a really, really important point, that actually whatever courses students are enrolled onto now, they know what they are, so we can start this work already. Lots of schools sent out transition work. I'm not quite sure how many of the students will have actually completed that seriously until they've known that they're actually going to study that particular subject. So I think now is an opportunity to start that process and start communicating with students in preparation for their arrival in September. And I think very early on when they do arrive, it's really important that we get some form of assessment on where they're at in terms of what their gaps may be. And we're going to have to support those gaps immediately and identify those students who need the support so that they don't fall behind very quickly. I'm not worried that the number of students has increased in different subjects. I think it actually opens up opportunities for students that, as has been previously said, may have been blocked in the past from getting onto certain courses. But I think we will need to carefully monitor their progress in the next sort of 6 weeks or first 6 weeks of the term to make sure that we identify any support that's required and get in there quickly.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Aretha, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just agree with Emma. I think, there's always that lull between GCSE and A-levels and, catching up and making sure that, that the students have the right skills to start their A-level courses. And I think, as Emma said, we need to give them time to settle in. We need to acknowledge the fact they've been out of school for so long. We need to make sure that we identify where they are falling behind or where they are struggling really quickly, so that we can give them the intervention. It's not their fault they've been out of school. It's not their fault they're in this situation. And we need to make sure that whatever plans we have in September incorporates some form of catch-up, particularly around literacy and numeracy, that English and maths, because those students who are going on to courses need those two in particular the majority of the time in order to make that change from GCSE to A-level. So if they have missed out on some of that core learning, which they will have done because they've not been in school since March, we need to make sure that whatever course we put in place incorporates some of that learning so they've got something, because without that knowledge base they may well struggle when they get into the later part of year 12 and into year 13 because they just don't have that secure knowledge base. We need to ensure that by hook or by crook we get that in there.
Absolutely, thank you, that's really helpful. David, what's happening at your sixth form?
So I think we definitely should start from the assumption that the grades that children have are grades that they were capable of achieving in the exam, rather than starting from the assumption that some of these are wrong and we've kind of got to catch them out, find the ones that were wrong. So start from a positive assumption that everyone's capable of whatever they had on their exam sheets. What does worry me more, much more than incorrect grading, is just that inconsistency of experience people have had over the past few months, and that creates actually a very difficult experience for young people starting sixth form, where they maybe come into a class where, rather than everyone having had a fairly similar experience in the past few months and being similarly ready for a course, you actually have some people who haven't had much educational provision since March, and they are in a class with people who actually have been doing a bridging course to get ready for that A-level since March. And that is a big challenge for teachers who are suddenly dealing with not just a kind of natural spectrum of prior attainment, but also a big spectrum of what people have actually been doing and their level of preparedness. And And it's also a challenge for those students. If you're someone who knows that you're full of potential, but you didn't have the same opportunities over the past 6 months or so, going into a class and suddenly you realise that there are people who are prepared and you weren't, that's going to have a big motivational impact on you. And I think our big priority has got to be assessing where people are at, giving them the help that they need to make sure they can be successful, on the assumption that everyone who we've admitted should be, rather than on the assumption that's sort of implied in the question and in the way that a lot of people talk about this, that we've got to catch these erroneous, incorrect high grades.
Thank you, David. Yes, that's a really good point, and I'm really glad to hear what a positive approach you're taking to it. I think there's certainly going to need to be quite a bit of time in September taken just to take stock of where everyone is at and make sure everybody is settled back in. And best of luck with that. Stephen, what would you like to add?
Just to kind of think, we kind of put something in the mix. If people are worried about the fact they've got children, if you like, with the wrong grades in front of them, if they actually think about it, they have had every year. So in other words, the idea that our exam system is so perfect that it gives children the right grades just isn't true. And so you kind of look at Ofqual's own data, they're kind of looking at the reliability of marking, and you tend to have in kind of English history quite low levels of reliability compared to maths and science, where the answers tend to be a little bit more objective. And so just park the whole idea of children having wrong grades, because you could argue they always have had, or you could argue, well, they've always had what they've had. The other thing that I think is possibly worth putting into people's thoughts, particularly where they're not progressing to a school sixth form where they're already known, or they're coming into a school sixth form not known, is the impact of not just being out of school, but the impact of loss and bereavement at a level that we haven't seen previously, which is much higher in disadvantaged communities, which is much higher in BMAE communities. And so it's not simply, if you like, the loss of learning that occurred in GCSE. And so what it faces the profession with is a great opportunity to look at induction. So just, have we got it right? And, David's right in terms of the variability that has come within the system. But it was, if you like, it was always thus. And I think what COVID has done is it has just absolutely highlighted the inequalities, both within society, within our system, and they are now outed in a way that people can't pretend are not there. Final thing, we can't pretend that exams were fair to children from disadvantaged backgrounds either. They just fundamentally weren't. I mean, we had children who had happy, stable homes, and we had other children that we were buying mattresses for them to sleep on. And the idea that exam systems were dealing with those inequalities rather than exacerbating them wasn't true. So I think it's kind of really looking at the whole induction process and saying, right, we've got to be really, really sharp here. And those things that maybe we knew now are front and centre for us.
Yes, absolutely. And you're completely right. I've had students in sixth form who were expected to settle in and be absolutely fine and weren't, and vice versa. So it's not already a perfect process. And that's an important thing to remember. I think one of the things you've raised there is the issue of well-being. And I know for a lot of schools, this has really come to the fore in the last few months, thinking about how to support the well-being of students alongside supporting their learning. Do any of you have particular support programs in place for coming back in September to help make sure that well-being and mental health are first and foremost? David?
Yeah, so we absolutely do. But one of the things I'd like to do is challenge one of the premises, or not so much the premise, but the way that we approach this. So one of the things that has astounded me throughout this period is how brilliant the young people in our school are, and how unfazed they are by circumstances and situations that would terrify me as an adult. And I think there is a positive message to give to our young people when they're coming back into school, which doesn't mean that you don't have to do all of the bespoke support and detailed support that people need where they are facing really challenging situations. But I think there are two ways you can approach September. One is to say and vocally expect people to come back in with lots of problems and issues and be really struggling and tell them we expect them to be struggling. I think the other is a really positive message, which is that this generation has just got through a crisis unlike any other. They've just got through a crisis that we have not faced as a country for decades, that magnitude. And they have coped with it brilliantly. And they've been given hugely challenging circumstances, but they have kept their education going. They have supported their family. They have supported their friends, and they're still here and they're still going with that. And there's a lesson that they can take from that that's a really empowering one, which is that they have it within them, the character and the resilience to be able to cope with these things. And so, the children who might have come in and said, I'm intimidated by exams, I'm intimidated by a friendship fallout, I'm intimidated by these things, those things are dwarfed in comparison to having gone, been a teenager through the time of coronavirus. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't lots and lots of challenges and lots of things that we need to do to support people with very specific situations. But I just think there's a message for our young people here, which is that they are great and they've just proven they can do it. And so any lack of self-confidence or self-esteem that maybe sometimes makes these situations harder to deal with needs to be banished, because they have just shown that they can be the generation that goes through challenges and difficulties that mine never had. So we can't ever, look down on them because they've just done it and faced it. And they are stronger than we were at this point in their lives. And I think they should be proud of that and just approach this from a positive starting point, that they've handled that and are getting through it.
That's wonderful, David. Thank you. Yes, and I think we're looking at a generation of leaders and young people with huge potential having come out of something like this. And I look forward to see what you and your peers will achieve, Hanifah and Ray. Let's think a little bit now about the future. In terms of next year, we've seen a much higher proportion of top grades being issued this year, and there are quite a few concerns around what this will mean going forward. What are you feeling about how this is going to affect future cohorts? And should this year be taken as an anomaly out of the mix? Claire, you're shaking your head.
I think we're overly hung up on what this all means. And this is when I spoke a little bit earlier about we've got to decide what the purpose of exams are. This is exactly the point. So if it's about rewarding and recognising 11 years of a young person's educational experience, the grades are the grades. If it's about making sure that we're measuring the effectiveness of schools with algorithms, and we all know how well they work, or metrics that are imposed externally to try and show that some schools are more effective than others, then they already collide. And then we've got the third collision where we're actually taking the temperature of the whole system by saying that we shouldn't have grade inflation. So grade inflation only matters if we're not recognising and rewarding young people. It only matters if we've got a zero-sum education system, which is about making sure that we maintain the status quo. And then into the mix, we've got school leaders who are fighting and scrabbling to try and improve their grades, which means if we're having no grade inflation, other schools do less well. And I think now is the time not to worry about our top grades. Have we got too many? Have we got too few? But it's actually, what are exams for? Do we actually want them to do those three things? Can they do those three things? Which of the three things are most valid? Recognising for children, effectiveness of the school or temperature of the system, what do we want them to be and do? And I think the longer we start talking about whether people deserve top grades, don't deserve top grades, whether we level out the system for next year, whether we recognise this is not right, then we're having the wrong conversation. And the right conversation is about why have we got more top grades? We've got more top grades because we're recognising young people, what they did over the course of 11 years, and we're not putting it onto one high stakes exam, end of course exam, in which of course we can say that 10 people in our class should be able to get a grade 8 in maths. On the exam, somebody might have missed 2 questions, somebody might have had something dreadful happen the day before, somebody might have had an absolutely fantastic day and got a 9 instead of an 8. So teacher assessment is an imperfect science if we're looking at a correlation with exam scores, but it's a pretty perfect reflection of where young people's achievements are. And I think we need to recalibrate our conversations, rethink what we're about as educationalists, and actually start having the conversation that puts kids in the middle. Kids are what it's about. We're about educating young people. We're trying to make sure that they've got the future, be they SEND, be they young people at independent schools. Actually, everybody deserves a chance to be able to be the best person they can be, and we need to be making sure exams reflect that, rather than the headlines of, oh, we've got double the number of top grades this year, and that's a travesty. It's not a travesty for the young people.
Thank you, Claire. And it is certainly important to think about the young people involved. I think it's undeniable, though, that there will be people in the system who won't have that focus and will be looking at the overarching view of how this year has played out. How do we convey to them the sort of message that you want to share?
Well, I think it's up to us. It's up to us to have the conversation. It's up to us as professionals to actually start to have the right conversation. I think it was David who talked about we have dichotomous conversations where the media represent one view and then the educational profession do the complete opposite. Actually, the answer is usually in the middle. And if we actually clarify and determine why we want to have exams, what they're for, what their purpose is, what the purpose of the education system is, and stop trying to measure the immeasurable and find a better way of measuring the effectiveness of schools or the quality of the education system, we're probably in a better place.
Thank you, Claire. Stephen, as the chair of a group of influential head teachers, where do you see your role in this process?
The ragtag bunch. I kind of look at it, and I think it's one of those things. I kind of just don't look at it as grade inflation. I just go back to this fundamental idea that you're doing two totally different assessments, so trying to compare them doesn't really make a great deal of sense. And I think there's a likely that we're going to try and overplay the difference it might make by a few more pupils getting, if you like, in the 7 to 9 range, or getting the 4+ range, that might not actually play out in reality. And I think it's part of the reflection for the system about whether we're going to ground zero here, or we've got a bleep year. And it's kind of quite a good challenge for us to think about so what exactly are these exams at 16 trying to do? So we want to try and recognise and reward that which pupils have learned within the sphere of the intellectual. And we want to try and say to them, we think that this might be the kind of opportunities that you should have. And then we might say, gosh, do we really want to do that? Or are there other things? And, just playing out, if a pupil gets a grade 1, a 2 or a 3, what's the difference between those grades? Why have we got 3 different grades, with the problem that wherever you make a line, you produce something quite artificial? So I'm going to make up a number. I got 59%, and so I got a grade 6. Alex, you got 60%. So you got a higher grade, because that's where the boundary was. And yet the difference between us is negligible, and it isn't justifiable. And so I think it's unlikely to happen, I think, in the short term, but I think there's some questions, particularly now as we're seeing people going into training and education up until 18, to us ask, what's the function we need of these exams? And that might lead to kind of different processes in terms of what we think this should be. As I say, is it just a blip year, and we go back to saying, right, 70% can pass and 30% won't get the grade 4 or more, or whether we actually use it as an opportunity to say we need a bit of time for this to rethink, but what is it? So I'm not in favour of removing exams totally at 16, because you're going to then have to have a way of saying, well, who might be best suited at the moment to go towards A-level courses, and what kind of standard might we reach? So we've got to have something there. But can I just, and David might want to come back again, I wouldn't want us to get into this. There's 2 mindsets. There's this mindset and there's that mindset kind of thinking about bringing people back. Our mindsets are quite nuanced. And so I think it's perfectly possible to say a bit of structure and regularity for us all, having been out of that, would be lovely, but eyes on all the time. And I don't think David wasn't saying that, but I just don't like it when we go to, there's 2 options. There's not. There's a myriad of approaches that schools might use, and they need to kind of think and reflect that through. So yeah, long answer to a short question, but I think it's what we see this year as the start of something quite different, or it's just a blip. And that's for the system to sort out. I think that we probably need something different at 16, which isn't, these kind of 9 grades going through.
Be interesting to see how it plays out. Thank you, Stephen. That's really helpful. David, do you want to come back on that, or are you? Oh, I think David might be frozen temporarily. We'll give him a moment to reconnect. Looks very thoughtful, though. We've actually had a question from Ben Gibbs, which follows up on some of the points that you've reiterated there, Stephen. So when we're thinking about coming back in September, and we're thinking about well-being and how to approach going forward with things, how are schools going to be approaching staff well-being, given the stress and the concerns that people have had to deal with in the last few months? Does anyone have any thoughts? Emma, would you like to come in on this one?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I think that I'm really concerned about staff well-being because for a number of staff, they haven't been in school since lockdown and having the right systems in place, and everything's different. We're currently looking at our risk assessment and having to think about just even moving around the building and the timings of the school day. The systems are different for everybody, and it's going to take people time to get up to speed. So I think having that staggered start and having a rigorous induction into the changes and giving people the time for Q&A to make sure they know exactly what they're doing will help them transition back into the term, which is already a shock for most teachers at this time of year, but obviously even more so this year. And then, of course, there's the students who, for a number of them, have had very little structure, or, certainly when we had our year 10s in back in June, one of the things that they described was the shock of actually sitting down for 4 or 5 hours when they've been used to, moving around. Just really simple, practical things like that. I think we're going to need to really consider the detail of that and make allowance for students and staff in every possible way. And we're already in the process of doing that. But it's an evolving picture, and it will change as we go through, and we'll see what happens in terms of, the next steps in terms of any further outbreaks or anything that we have to deal with. The one thing we are really confident about is being able to manage that, having dealt with remote learning and becoming experts on Teams and so on. We are confident that if we go into a lockdown situation, be it isolated or not, we're able to cope with that much more effectively than we were at the start of lockdown in March.
Yes, it's so important to appreciate everything that everyone's learned as well, isn't it? There's been huge steps that I think will serve us really well in the future. Thank you, Emma. I realise we're coming towards the end of our time now, and I want to give my colleague Will a chance to provide us with a summary. But before we do that, we have another question here about the autumn resits. Before we wrap up, I'd be interested to know how many students you are anticipating to take the autumn GCSE resits, and if so, how you're planning to support them through that process. David, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, we currently don't have very many. I think I've got 3 people in school who've indicated that they want to. Obviously, there's still time for them to do that, and lots of people have been thinking over the past couple of days. So we will wait and see how many people we have, what they want to do in terms of subjects. But our plan is to do the best that we can with the capacity that we've got to try and help support them to go and do the retake. They're our kids. It was our responsibility to get them to their exams. It's not their fault those exams didn't happen. And so we want to do whatever we can.
Thank you. Aretha, do you have any thoughts on this one? Any students at your school?
Not on the resets, but I just wanted to go back to a point around wellbeing, if that's okay.
Sure.
I just wanted to flag up the wellbeing of the leadership teams. Actually, it's been really challenging for a lot of leaders to respond to daily emails from the DfE that change throughout the course of the day, and then to create these risk assessments to prepare for the reopening of schools. And I just think, there's some work to be done around the wellbeing of staff body, but also around the leadership team and making sure, they feel happy and secure in their jobs, and in creating an environment that is as risk-free as it possibly can be, given the situation that we're in. It's a difficult job, And I just wanted to flag that up on behalf of school leaders. I think, we've done an amazing job, but it is tough.
Thank you, Aretha. You're absolutely right. And I think we've seen both in this webinar and our seminar from last week that school leaders have done incredible things this year and should really be celebrated. And it's great to hear how many young people are really feeling well supported and impressed by how their schools have helped them through. We should all acknowledge that. So thank you so much. I think David wanted to just come back in on a point that he missed out on there when he was temporarily frozen. David.
Yeah, and not to the thing that Stephen said. I mean, I totally agree that that it's not a dichotomy; it's a spectrum, and there are ends of the spectrum. And the reality is that any attempts to place the entire system at a point on the spectrum is inherently going to be flawed. I think where I wanted to come back is maybe just being clear that there's another thing which is a spectrum, which is views about the role of exams within the system. And the risk of disagreeing with head teachers who are much more experienced and qualified than I am. I'm not sold on the idea that the exam system is deeply inherently broken. I think there's an awful lot of research that would lead me to be concerned about a system that was based on teacher assessment, particularly around teacher biases, around the teacher assessment disadvantaging people from already disadvantaged groups. That would concern me quite greatly about a system of more teacher assessment. And the thing about exams is it means that on the day it's a level playing field. Now, of course, the reason it's not a level playing field overall is because life hasn't been a level playing field up until that point. And so you're assessing how someone performs on a day in a situation that is fair if you take the snapshot of that day, but is not fair if you think, well, how much effort has this person put in over their life? What opportunity have they had? Does this take account of their background, of what they've had to do to reach this position? And those two measurements that you might want to do are very different things. And at a system level, I would be wanting to do everything that we can and advocating as hard as possible for making us level the playing field up until that day of those exams, so that our most disadvantaged children have the chance to perform at the same level as their more advantaged peers, to even go and outperform them. I would be advocating for that. And so I just think that we probably all think that there are imperfections in the current system, and that the way that it works, our education system, can be improved. My starting point would be that a fair type measurement, acknowledging all of the reliability issues that Stephen's brought up, which are very much present, but a measurement that's fair on the day, we should be making fairer by levelling the playing field up until that point, and making sure that our education system, our social care system, all of the other things that surround the life of a disadvantaged child mean that they're able to excel in that moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. That's really helpful. It's a vast question, but what would the panelists like to see from the government going forward? Who feels brave enough to give their thoughts on what the government should be doing next? Stephen?
If I start with competence, it's just been, and I know it's a really difficult situation in which we've never done before, but you kind of look and think, could it be more shambolic? And you're struggling to think of how it could have been more shambolic. So I think, you could ask for competence, but I think there's other things that we would look at, which would certainly get a whole nother debate going for you. But kind of looking at 10 and 12 going in, I think we're beginning to reach a point where the amount of content that we have within our school system has just become extreme. Now, if I was 15 years ago, I'd be arguing for the opposite. We need more we need more solid subject matter. But I think, the Dylan William intervention about too much content being immoral. There's a wonderful blog by Solomon Kingnorth, which looks at outcomes in Estonia. And their kind of equivalent of GCSE maths is less than 80%, about 20% the size of ours in terms of content, yet they outperform in PISA. And it's all to do with, you can only learn so much, and at the minute we're just galloping through. So I think on a lot of things, taking what David said about, if we're going to do something different, let's not kind of just throw baby out with bathwater and ignore exams altogether, looking at the content going forward. I think there's some big things that they really need to look at in terms of the point that we've reached the accountability system almost more than anything, because I think one of the things that this year has shown is what happens where you start to put that back in a more sensible place. But if you want a specific, what I'd love them to do is to come up with £200 for each year for children who are free school meal children, and feed them during the school holidays. So from some very, very big stuff which would take years to do, to some absolute simple ones that they could put in place within weeks, which start to actually level the playing field. So I just think there's so much to do, but part of it is they've got to work with the profession, with social services, with health in a way which is genuinely communicative.
Yes, collaboration is vital, isn't it? I completely agree. Aretha, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I was just going to chip in and just say, for me, I'd like to see collaborative approach to all of this. I mean, we've had a situation where we've had to backpedal and U-turn and all of that sort of business, and we don't want to be there again. So this is an ideal opportunity now to, once that dust has settled, take stock, reflect, review, and engage partners who know the education system, who represent different institutions within the education system, and that can actually add value to that discussion so that we don't end up in this situation again. So for me, it's very much about engaging other stakeholders and working collaboratively to come up with a more robust and realistic plan to move forward.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I wonder whether Hanifah or Ray, you have any thoughts? We've heard from a lot of young people that they're feeling quite frustrated about what they've seen from the government. Do you have any thoughts on what you'd like to see going forward? Ray?
Definitely, because the time it took for the amount of changes to happen within the space of 1-2 weeks could have happened over the course of months. And the government, if they had, I guess with the gift of hindsight, they will look back on this and know that they should have conversed with professionals and different systems. But I feel like it's one of the obvious things that should have been pointed out a long time ago.
Brilliant. You're absolutely right. Thank you so much, Ray. Hanifah?
Yeah, for me, I just think the whole kind of indecisiveness around grades, definitely for a lot of young people, I would say has caused a lot of distrust in the government. And for me, when I was thinking about results day, in the weeks coming up to it, I did not even consider that I would be over-predicted or that they would be too generous. All I was worried about was not getting what I deserve. And I think they've just been so desperate to make sure that I'm not unfairly awarded opportunities. But, why not? You don't think, that I've worked hard enough for them. And I just felt really I just felt like it's been really unfair on me. And I just really was surprised by all the statistics about grade inflation and things like that, because that's not what I was expecting at all. And I think even if I was wrong, just having that distrust in the first place definitely doesn't feel fair. And it's really interesting, just going back to what David was saying about how well young people have handled it all. But to be honest, we haven't really had a choice. This was kind of the only option, to just get on with it and keep going. And I don't really think that's fair, because, ultimately I'm only 16, and I think it's caused a lot of young people to kind of grow up and think about politics a lot quicker and faster than they should have. And it's just been really overwhelming. And definitely you kind of forget that a lot of young people obviously use social media, and seeing the kind of Twitter headlines of all these terrible A-level horror stories and just thinking, yeah, that's going to be me. And it's been really difficult. So, yeah.
Well done on getting through it, Hanifah. It's been a huge challenge, and it sounds like you've coped extremely well. Ray, did you want to come in again?
Yeah, because I feel like following on from Hanifah, it really does pose a question to young people: what is the underlying and what's the underlying factor and use of the education system is to provide opportunities for the young people. And if you're going to try and limit them by potentially saying, oh, we're over predicting people, then it's it's just unfair, and it just doesn't kind of add up.
Yes, and I think as we seem to have said as a panel, which you're really echoing there, Ray, is that we need to take that step back and look at the real purpose of what's happening here. Thank you both for being so eloquent in the way you've talked about what has happened. It's a really tough thing to do, and I'm so grateful to have you joining us to share those thoughts. Before we wrap up, I wonder whether we could turn to a slightly more positive note to finish on. Would you be willing to share one thing with me, each of the panelists, that you are looking forward to in the future? Let's start with Claire.
Very near future, really looking forward to having all the young people and all the staff back in school. I think that's great. Middle term, longer term future, really looking forward to having young people having a voice, being listened to, and being able to use this experience to actually set out a path for their future and their children's future, although they're not thinking about that. That actually comes from a place of being listened to and listening to others.
Thank you, Claire. David, in a few seconds, your 1 point to look forward to.
I just can't wait for the 1st of September. I'm really looking forward to having the best, amazing bunch of young people back in my school. We've missed them a lot.
Thank you, David. That's lovely. Emma?
Yeah, same really, just to have everybody there and actually feel that you've got some kind of connection, to reconnect, that would be my one word, with the school community and the wider. Brilliant.
Aretha?
Echoing the same, I think. It's that hubbub of school and just that flow of, no day being exactly the same, and seeing the smiles on the kids' faces when they do come back in September will be just the icing on cake for me.
Great. Stephen?
I'm afraid I'm going to be totally shallow, but I'm going to be honest. It's my grandson's birthday on Monday, so that's going to be fabulous. And I've got a second grandchild in Australia, so if they ever give me a visa and we have a fly out, looking forward to seeing a second grandchild. But it's kind of that, I'm just at that stage of life, I'm afraid. But it's seeing now the generations coming through, and you want to work to make or to help make with other people the education system the best that it can be, and hopefully we will learn an awful lot from what has been a bizarre experience for everybody for the past 6 months about what we keep and what we might change and what we might want to lose, and that'd be great.
Perfect, thank you, and congratulations. And in one line, Ray?
For me, it's got to be hitting the ground running and continuing that friendly rivalry to continue to strive to improve with other students, both from other schools and your own.
Brilliant. Thank you so much and best of luck. Hanifah?
Honestly, I'm just really excited to start my history course. I've been reading up on it a bit, and I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah.
That's lovely to hear. Best of luck. I hope you really enjoy it. And now in the final 2 minutes, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Will, who's got the tough task of giving us some headline points briefly about the main issues we've discussed.
Thanks, Alex. Great conversation to listen in on. So thanks so much for everyone's thoughtful contributions. I think we've had 4 main themes come out of the discussion today. The first one is that there are actually some real positives to come out of this situation. We've heard about students' optimism, hope and resilience during what's been an extraordinary period of their lives. As Hanifah rightly pointed out, actually students haven't had a choice, they've had to deal with that. But equally, it may open the door to young people feeling more engaged with government and with politics going forward. The second key theme is that we can think about doing things differently. So the world hasn't stopped turning as we've used centre assessed grades and lost performance tables this year. We've rightly discussed the issue of exams. No, they've never been perfect, but that's nothing new. However, perhaps we should think about this in terms of making exams fairer rather than scrapping them all together. So the questions to ask about this going forward: firstly, is this year the start of something different, or is it a blip and a one-off? And secondly, what are our exams and qualifications for? Are they a temperature check for schools or recognition of young people's achievements? And how we frame them will depend on our answer to those questions. Third key theme is that this year's highlighted the system's incoherence. And that's been exacerbated by a lack of communication, sometimes miscommunication, sometimes ambiguous messaging. It's also been exacerbated by the inconsistency of remote learning. Pupils' experiences across the country of this would have been very, very different. It doesn't help to generalise what these experiences would have been like, but it does help to acknowledge what they may have been like as these pupils return to school in September. And I think a strong sense that if we find ourselves in this situation again, it needs to be managed differently and managed better. Finally, the fourth theme, some students are particularly at risk of falling further behind, those students being those at key transition points and those in current years 10 and 12. Students going into vocational pathways, students with forms of SEND, and of course, and sadly, the pupils who have experienced bereavement and grief. In terms of next steps, we've heard lots about just cracking on and getting the support that students need in place as they return to school. Sixth form and colleges should use students other grades beyond BTECs over the coming weeks to make decisions about their entry. As David has been saying, we need to avoid unhelpful generalisations about pupils' experiences. Those don't help us arrive at sensible ways forward. We need to start from the assumption that pupils are capable of fulfilling the potential indicated by their grade sheets and not assuming that those achievements are overinflated. We need to support students who want to take resits in the autumn to do so. If this does happen again and going forward, we need better and earlier communication across the system, but particularly between the central organisations of government, Ofqual, etc., and with school leaders. And finally, we should be feeding children during the holidays.
Thanks so much, Will. That's really, really helpful. We're 2 minutes over, so thank you everyone for bearing with us. I really appreciate it, and thank you for joining our discussion today. A huge thank you to all our participants. Your points have been really helpful and interesting, and it's been great to speak with all of you. And best of luck to everyone in the future going forward, especially Ray and Hanifah. Hope everything goes your way. Thanks so much.